internet to a humble guide on psychoanalytic literature. So in this video I wanted to share with you my thoughts on how to begin psychoanalytic literature or how to continue to read it once you're a trained professional. So I'm gonna divide this video in basically three parts. The first part is as a complete neophyte beginner, meaning someone that has no knowledge whatsoever of psychoanalysis but just wants to get into it, wants to understand it, wants to start building knowledge on the subject. The intermediate level of perhaps you are yourself a psychotherapist or you're a student, and you want to start with psychoanalysis, so that's an intermediary level as you already have some form of knowledge of it, perhaps, but you're not too sure where to continue. And the third and last one is you're a trained professional, you know psychoanalysis, and you don't know what to continue or what to pursue now that you know and mastered the basics. So let's start with the beginner. So, very strangely enough, if you're a beginner, I wouldn't advise you to start with Freud. Not at least if you're not guided by a teacher, by a university, or by a seasoned therapist. Because the problem with Freud is that he can be quite complicated to understand, even though he tried his best to open up his branch of thinking and his methodology. And that's a big but, he stays quite subtle and complicated. I've had colleagues in the past that have tried to self-teach themselves in psychoanalysis. Colleagues that were not, and I precise, mental health professionals, like really people I work with but who have another profession. And they found it very hard, if not virtually impossible, to really understand what Freud was on about. Because the problem with Freud is that you really have to know what you're looking for, and you really have to organize stuff. And if you start with his thinking on meta-psychology, you're going to get completely lost. And the problem also becomes, if you start with the clinical cases of Freud, they're very interesting, but he's a man of his time. So you might feel that it's distasteful to read what he has to write, because it's permeated with his own ideas as a man of his time. So we have a lot of legwork to go through. As a beginner, what you should do is read people who have written on Freud. Mainly, if you can, someone that's relatively modern. What I mean by modern is like written in the last 20 years, because the problem with psychoanalysis is there's been a lot of evolution throughout the history of the field. But Freud is he's the beginner. So there's a lot of criticism that he has gotten, which some very good criticism and some very bad criticism and misunderstanding of his ideas. Problem is, if you read Freud right now, you might think that the criticism is completely warranted, 100%, but some of it is, but not all. And you need someone that's contemporary to be able to tell you, yes, this was right, no, this was wrong, this is what was interesting, this is what was his cognitive bias. And someone that can do that, unfortunately, I don't know in other countries. In France, there's been a lot of good works done by Nasio, a psychiatrist and psychoanalysis, to order the ideas and try and make it digestible for a beginner. And he wrote very good books on Freud. So, and Paul Laurent also, is an expert on Freud and wrote stuff that is intelligible and is there to break down. There's others, of course, even in France, but the goal here, I'm trying to broaden it beyond France, but the goal here as a complete beginner is not to jump right into Freud. It's to get someone that understands Freud well and in a way deconstructs Freud to give it to you the modern ideas that are interesting and important, and what Freud is remembered for, not in public eye, but in the clinical field, since that we can still, even at present, use Freud to explain. Like, for example, one of the main concepts I think that has held the test of time really, really well for Freud is fetishism and perversion, which I feel has like really, really a good staying power. And it's stuff that I feel is very complicated to talk about nowadays. Not that Freud was necessarily wrong, but you really have to explain it through and through and really take the time to, how can I say, take a step back, really. Like, for example, his theories on penis envy and his wrong, according to me, assumption that women don't have a superego, which is odd, right? Anyway, Freud wrote a hell of a lot, like 28 books, about 28 books. So, enormous material. So don't start by yourself. Start with someone that knows their stuff. Like that, you will get the main ideas without having to lose yourself in the time period, in the context, with the wars going on. When I mean the wars, I mean like the wars of schools, because even at the time of Freud, there was schisms where some people broke off, like Adler, Jung, and he does in his essays criticize them. And if you don't know what it's about, you're going to be half lost. So, very simply, start with someone that knows his stuff. Once you have a good understanding of it, you should basically be able to start with something that interests you, because you have to have a baseline of concepts. For example, you have to know what repression means for Freud, what a defense mechanism is, what, for example, fetishism is, and so on and so forth. And once you have those basics in your mind, then you can start reading Freud proper, I feel, because you're going to start understanding where's the right, where's the wrong, be able to do some triage, but yourself, not with anyone else. And from that point on, after you've read a bit of Freud in the text, like not everything, absolutely not, it's massive, but once you've read what interests you, then you can open up to other authors or other sites of interest or other stuff you're interested in. If you're ever interested in Lacan, whatever I've said right previously, right, is double. Like, I mean, you cannot, and I can't stress enough, you cannot start Lacan without someone explaining it to you, or if you haven't read something beforehand, because you're going to be completely lost. Because look, Freud tried to make it accessible. It was complicated, but he really made an effort. Lacan makes no effort whatsoever. All right, you have to get it. He's not going to help you try and understand it. It's or you understand it or you don't. Plain and simple. So Lacan really, really, really read someone beforehand. I mean, if it was true for Freud, it's like 4 times as true for Lacan. So now that you've passed on to Freud, you're gonna have to understand that psychoanalysis, like an enormous amount of human sciences, has branched out into numerous factions or schools. Those schools have contradictory explanations on phenomena. Here you're gonna have to, as a beginner, make some kind of choice. What I mean by that is that you're gonna have to go in depth into what your school is and what you feel is accurate. So here, at this point, you should become an intermediaire, meaning halfway through or half knowledgeable about psychoanalysis. And once you've become half knowledgeable, you're going to have to operate a reading of many authors. So at this point, I would highly recommend you to read people like Winnicott, people like Melanie Klein, people like Introductions to Lacan, like Zizek, and so on and so forth, psychosomatic, and so on and so forth. And read, not everything, absolutely not. You get the main texts of each author, or get the main ideas of each author, and start to think of what you feel matches with your own clinical understanding, your own ideas, your own perceptions. And at that point, once you've gotten all of like that matching, start digging into it. I have to make a little precision here. If you stop halfway through and go back, it's okay. There's no problem with that. You don't lose anything. On the contrary, even if it's not your application, you still gain something through those understanding. You might be able to even communicate with colleagues who have that training or who have that, what we call in French, obédience, meaning theoretical assumptions. So you're not wasting any time. You're just maybe not finding exactly what's yours. And that's very important, because at that intermediary level, you have to find what speaks to you as a person, be it Jung, it can be anyone really. And it can change, and that's also something that's very important. I myself have gone through Jung, Freud, Lacan, Rollo May, Irvin Yalom, and finally now I'm at this point, I'm an objects relationship professional, and basically Fernburn, Klein, Bion, Winnicott, and so on and so forth. So this is going to be the point where you choose where you want to go, knowing that it's not exclusive. Like, it's not because you choose one that you have to cut out everything else. On the contrary, I would even encourage you to integrate or try and integrate stuff. Not everything can become coherent because there are contradictory statements. For example, very simply, countertransference is accepted in object relation theory and for Freudians, but not the Carnians. The Carnians will not work with that, and will even be judgmental if you ever try and propose the idea of a countertransference and the work you can do with patients. So you have to be careful, and that's another point. Once you're at that stage, or if you're in a professional setting, meaning training, I should say, once you are training in a school, you have to be quite careful, because there's some people that are accepted in the school and some that are not. You have to be careful, not because the teachers will necessarily lash out on you or undermark you or punish you. They won't. But, and this is a big but, there are things where they're going to make you understand that we don't talk about certain authors, or they do know who you're talking about, but they don't know what the author said, and there's a sort of suspiciousness that might develop. So you have to be careful on where you invest, and know that not everyone plays nice with everyone. So you just have to be a little wary of that. That doesn't mean you can't use them or you can't think about them. On quite the opposite, you have to, I think, have as many ideas as you can, just to stimulate yourself. That doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but just to have the stimulation. And once you've at that intermediary level where you've chosen your school, you're starting to read the texts and the authors, what's next? So here you should have a good understanding of your school of analysis and of the basics. At this point, you often started to train, you're often starting to see patients, or at least having internships. So what happens next? Well, next, and I would say this is the most wonderful phase and beautiful, you start exploring. Whatever interests you, you just go for it. And just be happy. Of course, it's valuable at any stage, but this is where it really becomes crucial, because you can't live your life as a therapist just with the bare bones of the theory. You have to enjoy expanding. And when I mean that, I don't want to guilt trip anyone, because fundamentally it's at your pace. You might read one book every 6 months, one book a year, just go to seminars. Everything is okay. You do you, and that's very good, 100%. But that moment is, you have to understand that it's super interesting, because if you don't acquire new ideas, you tend to turn round and round in circles, where everything's going to become kind of stale. So it's very important to open up at certain points when you feel comfortable, when you feel that there's something to be gained, into something else. That's the, I would say, mastery level, in which you know what you're talking about, but you still want to acquire new ideas at your pace. In that phase, it's very important to enjoy the process, because at this phase, most likely you won't have anyone, like you won't have a teacher, you won't have an institution backing you, not necessarily, but it's going to be important to have that ongoing continuation, because all those ideas are going to start to stimulate you. For example, in my case, it's only relatively recently, in the 3 last years, that I've really read Fernburn, and it's been a wonderful ride to read him. It rekindled something in me, and I was very excited by those ideas, both intellectually and even clinically. It was like top notch, and it allowed me to do so much more. And this is pretty much what it's going to allow you. Reading and going to seminars and really investing into psychoanalysis is going to help you to both navigate the clinical setting, but also to rekindle that enthusiasm that you had at the very start when you were beginning, like, oh, this is so exciting, this is so interesting, I want to know more. Because basically, even though I've presented it in phase, it's a continuum in which the enjoyment, the epistemological fun of the beginner phase is still going to be there at the end. It's just going to be more mature, not because it was immature, but because you've gained access to a lot of knowledge, and therefore you know how to do correct triage, avoid the bad books, because that's something I haven't touched upon in this review, but there is a lot of bad books on psychoanalysis. And when I mean bad, I don't mean necessarily badly written, but books that don't necessarily understand psychoanalysis. So very, very often, those books come from people that are not necessarily themselves invested in psychoanalysis, but that have read Freud and think they got an understanding of the full picture of psychoanalysis. Those books, in my opinion, are kind of semi-worthless. Semi because if they criticize Freud, there's always something to be gained in criticism, I think. But they're a bit worthless also because those people never criticize more modern tenets of psychoanalysis, which have branched out from Freud. For example, a good example of this is Le Crépuscule d'une idole of Onfray. So he's a French philosopher, and he criticizes Freud enormously. But the book is not that useful because fundamentally he criticizes Freud on Freud's life and saying that, well, Freud's life had an impact on his theories. And yeah, sure, I mean, it's accurate, you're right, but that doesn't mean he's wrong, and that doesn't mean that your argument that he inspired himself or understood stuff of his life makes it wrong. I mean, it's a bit of an odd argument to make. Like, I mean, every thinker has inspiration in his own personal life. Like, I mean, I'm sure that, for example, Fernburn and Guntrip were interested in schizoid personality because they themselves had schizoid dynamics. Does it mean that it's wrong because they inspired themselves from their own personal take? Or Winnicott on his idea of false self, does it mean it's wrong? Or Masood Khan with his hidden self, does it mean that he's wrong, intellectually speaking? And see, that's where I think those books kind of fall down and fall flat on their faces. It's because, yeah, sure, I mean, you've criticized, but I mean, this was not much value in the criticism. Now, for the criticism to be good, and that I encourage you to always remain critical of everything you read. It should not be taken as a given or as a truth. Never. You should never take it as such. You should always take it as a joyful hypothesis. That's something that's going to stimulate you, but not necessarily something that's true. Also, I have to stretch this. Once you've got that knowledge, you have a responsibility towards the patient and towards other people to make it very clear that this is not the truth, that your understanding is limited by what you know, what you don't know, and your intellectual framework. By no means are we asserting a truth on the subjectivity of another human being. That's despicable if someone ever does that, because it's not about clipping something onto someone. It's about trying to understand the best we can together. And when I mean together, it can be with someone else, but it can also be with a patient. So global understanding. And no fairy, as good as it might be, no model is able to guess exactly what the patient is. And you can't just clip an understanding a priori onto a patient. That's a no-go. And honestly, I think that beginners might struggle a bit with that at the beginning. But I mean, they very quickly understand, I feel. I mean, there's not that much of a problem. And if you have mastered everything and you still have that vision of clipping the fairy on the person, then I don't think that you're very open to the idea of not doing that. And that's where I'm gonna basically stop with the clipping aspect of this video. So, very simply, just remember that there's no ending point in basically psychoanalytic literature. I've been reading it for the better part of 12 years, perhaps even more, and there's no ending. There's no ending, and it can feel daunting, but it's also wonderful, because there's always something new to learn, something new to uncover, something new to think about. And I think that that's the most exciting part of it, that it's not some rigid, dead field. It's something that's moving, it's alive, and there's a whole range of new stuff developing all the time. And even nowadays, I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff written about gender, about identity, and I'm dying to really see it coming in full force, really. Anyway, all this to be said is that, very simply, I'm going to summarize what I've just said. So this is basically the conclusion. When you're a beginner, don't start with Freud, start with an introduction about Freud or about psychoanalysis as a whole. Get the basics into your mind. Always have good psychoanalytic vocabulary as or dictionary, because it can get very muddy at times. Secondly, once you've acquired the basics, let's say, well, basically you have to choose, because not everyone agrees, and you have to go for what you feel is the best. And whatever you feel the best, you do you. Very important. And thirdly, once you've mastered stuff, not just the basics, but really you really invested in a school of thought, and now you're wondering where to go, well, it's like an open world video game. The world is your oyster, and just go for whatever interests you. And even if you don't agree with the person, you might find an idea interesting, or a reference in a book that will allow you to think about something else. And of course, if you are in training, you can always read the texts that are provided, because often the teachers and educators will explain them to you, or explain the nuance in the texts, which can be very interesting as well. So fundamentally, what I want you to really keep from this video in your minds is that what's fundamental is for you to enjoy, because if you don't enjoy reading or acquiring new knowledge, well, it's gonna be a hassle, and that's no fun. And really, you have to keep the fun in psychoanalysis. Yes, I know it's an opinion, and a controversial one at that, because psychoanalysis is not really known for fun. But you have to keep that, I think, a part of that enjoyment, and it's very important, because that's what's going to carry all of your acquisition and all the work you're going to be able to do with the patients. Because at the end of the day, you're acquiring all this to be able to use it with human beings and help them and make their lives more productive, more serene, and that's wonderful, and it's a beautiful job. But sometimes you just need external help with that job, and that's where the books, the knowledge, and even perhaps these videos come in to stimulate something of your mind. So that's pretty much my conclusion for this video. So I hope you liked it, and remember, it's only my opinion, and it's not the truth. I will see you in the next one. Bye.